We are now at the point in our schedule when we typically send you off to classes around campus to learn from our outstanding faculty. And this year, of course, we're bringing our class to you. So our first class is Aging Populations and Urban Housing of the Future. This will be taught by Professor Caroline Cicero. Caroline Cicero is an instructional associate professor at the USC Davis School of Gerontology, where she teaches courses in policy and social sciences. She is also the director of the USC Age Friendly University Initiative, which is building a coalition of faculty, staff, students, alumni, and retirees to study the university's built environment and experiences for older Trojans. Her primary research interests are making local communities better places to grow old, fighting ageism in society and culture, and educating students to embrace aging and engage in policy change. After Professor Cicero's presentation, she will be taking Q&A. As a reminder, as we've done already today, please submit your questions by typing them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I think we're all getting the hang of it now, so we appreciate your questions when it's time. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Cicero. We turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And I loved hearing from all the students. Super exciting. I'm so happy to be here. I spoke, I think 2 years ago at Going Back to College Day, of course, in a little bit of a different setting. So I'm happy to be here now from my son's bedroom where the feed seemed to be the best. So again, I teach in the School of Gerontology, and some of you are familiar with it. I teach classes in social policy, in sociology. I teach medical ethics to a lot of our undergrads who will go on to med school. I teach introduction to aging to our master's students. I have students in Europe. I have students in China. I have students in Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, students here in Los Angeles and around the country. So it's a super exciting time to be able to teach online. Also, in this last year, I've worked a lot in the area of creativity and aging, and I'll get at that as well too. I've been doing a lot of research into the area. And I've been doing a lot of research into death and dying this year as well. As we know, that can be in the news quite often. Next slide, please. So the Age Friendly University Initiative, you can check out our website, agefriendly.usc.edu. We've been a little bit on hold in the last year. We were awaiting, of course, our new provost and our new president and all that we would be able to think about in the coming year. And of course, you know, there have been some other things to think about. So expect to hear more about our plans in future months and years. But we've been kind of just, you know, brewing in what we've done so far and kind of learning a lot in research and background information without a lot of programming in this last year. Next, please. The Age Friendly University Coalition is a global network. You may have heard me talk about it 2 years ago. It started in Dublin at Trinity College Dublin and has expanded around the world. We were the first in California to join the network. UCLA has joined, Cal State University Long Beach, Cal State San Bernardino, and we intend to work cooperatively with them. We've also worked a bit with you, the Half Century Trojans and the Ameritise Center, and in coordination with the City and County of Los Angeles's age-friendly program called Purposeful Aging. Next slide. So here I'm tasked to talk about urban housing and what the future means, which is kind of a difficult topic, honestly, at the moment, because we don't know, right? There is so much uncertainty. We do know that most people live in cities and suburbs. And in fact, most older people live in suburbs of large metropolitan areas. So if we combine both those groups, we have about 75% of older people living in metropolitan areas in an urban metropolis. Next slide, please. And so some of the work I've done, as I mentioned, is in coordination with the City and County of Los Angeles Purposeful Aging Initiative. If you Google AARP Livable Communities, you can see whether the community in which you live has joined the network. The goal is for all 88 cities within Los Angeles County to join. If you're in Orange or Riverside, San Bernardino, Ventura, your county can join, as well as individual cities and across the whole country. So there's over 350 cities who have joined so far. And I've been working, counseling, encouraging, advising cities in their efforts to make more age-friendly environments, including housing. My background, how I came to get a PhD in gerontology, was to study housing. And I'll tell you more about how that unfolded in a few minutes. Next slide, please. I told you this last time I spoke as well, in case you're at that event. But so there are 8 domains of livable communities. And then Los Angeles added another one, which is emergency preparedness and resilience. And I think you would understand why that's important with our weather, earthquakes, mudslides, fire season, etc. But I will say that in the last year, the preparation that has been made by the city and county working together has been so important with meeting the needs of older people for food and transportation during this pandemic. So there are 4 categories that are on the built environment side and 4 that are on the social environment side. And what I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes will get at that as well. Next slide, please. So to get at what our population is in the county, we can look at these predictions. By the year 2050, we expect about 2.5 million or more people to be 65 and up in the county of Los Angeles. This graphic shows you by race and ethnicity. The Latino population will be growing in age and size as well. Asian population, a steady uptick as well, whereas the population or proportion of white older adults will decline a bit. African American population remains pretty steady. And then this is all based on census data where people self-identify, as mixed race or what their ethnicity or race is. So that's where these categories come from. Next slide as well. So here's the 85 and up population. And so the future of urban housing really is about the 85 and up population. The 85 and up cohort is the fastest growing segment of our population, no matter what background you come from. People, as you know, are living longer, and they are living longer with more independence. And so that is all exciting. And so we, as gerontologists and housing specialists and real estate watchers and community builders, can consider how we can best meet the needs of our 85 and up population moving forward. Next slide. Here's some characteristics in the city of LA of 65 and up. Now, I am very excited to get the 2020 census data. We won't have the data in for another year or two. So this data is a few years old, but the years since 2015, when these numbers were put together, is very similar. And so what I want you to look at is the bar over on the far right of people living alone. There's about a quarter of older adults in Los Angeles living alone. And so what does that mean for the future housing needs? As you can see, about 40% are living with disabilities. Many have language barriers. Many are born out of this country and may or may not be citizens. But this issue of living alone and living alone with disability is one that concerns me very much. Next slide, please. And so also what we need to consider is whether people are renting or owning. And that's been a big issue with this pandemic. So we have about 60% of owner-occupied units with the older adult population in the city and about 40% renter. Next slide, please. And so I want you to consider, you can think about it in yourself, we can put the answers out there in our Q&A, what was the ideal age-friendly housing pre-pandemic, right? Everything has been thrown out of whack in this pandemic period. We know that before the pandemic, BC, I'm calling it before COVID, about 10% of the labor force worked at home. When I wasn't teaching on campus, I worked from home quite often. Now I haven't been to campus since March 12th. It's been 11 months since I've been back on campus. I'm quite sure my plants are dead that I left there. But I taught 12 classes online last year, and I'm teaching 4 more now. So obviously technology makes working from home possible. And thinking about the ideal age-friendly urban housing is what I want you to consider for a minute or two. Next slide. When we think about age-friendly housing, we look at some of these issues. What technology is available to help people connect? Just an hour ago, I was on a virtual doctor appointment with my mother-in-law in North Carolina and her doctor, right? So the technology available to her makes her living far away possible and makes caregiving possible. What about transportation options for people who may be able to drive, but also may need assistance with getting around town? And then what about not only nutrition? As I mentioned, the Purposeful Aging program got really involved in delivering meals to people who were unable to get meals, especially at the beginning of the pandemic when we were first locked down, but also wellness opportunities. What's available in your community, at least in a normal year, right? And then what about intergenerational housing and programming? I'll show you some statistics on multi-generational households. Maybe you have your children or grandchildren living in your house, or maybe you are living in theirs, and maybe the pandemic has changed that situation. What about reducing isolation for that 25% of city of LA, older adults who live alone? And then mixed use developments. What do those mean? So these are some of the tenets, the factors that we look at when we talk about age-friendly housing of the past and of the future, and whether that pertains to right now is a question. Next slide, please. So here's an article from the Christian Science Monitor. You can look it up. Talks about multi-generational households. The more the merrier. I received a lot of Christmas cards this year that told me, our adult children have moved back in with us. It allows us to do this, this, and this. And that was super exciting in most regards. We know that that can bring issues as well. But the fact is that even before the pandemic, the numbers of intergenerational or multi-generational housing have gone way, way up. Next slide. Here's 2 graphics. I hope you can see them well enough from the Pew Research Center. If not, you can Google and look up Pew. Pew is a source of excellent demographic data. So 1 in 5 Americans live in a multi-generational household through 2016 is what this was showing. It's a little hard to read, but also in the year 1980, 1990 were the low points in young adults living back at home. So when I graduated from college in 1991, it was unheard of for me to consider moving back home. Of course, a few people I know did that, but now it is totally not unheard of to think of my adult children, my teenagers, or my college students moving back home with me. So now we have 30% of young adults, 25 to 29-year-olds, who before the pandemic were living back with their parents or with grandparents. And that's a big number. And so I know you would understand that a large part of that has to do with the cost of housing here in California, especially, right? There are many of us who know the cost of housing is prohibitive to having our kids maybe move back into Southern Cal if they've left the state. So maybe they've decided to settle elsewhere. Next slide. Also broken down by racial and ethnic group. Asian and Hispanic or Latino families are more likely to have multi-generational households than slightly less for African Americans, and then less for sure for white Americans. This is interesting. When I did my dissertation, I studied falls that happen within one's own home and people who end up in the hospital. And when I looked at the discharge plans, white and Black patients who were overcoming their injuries were discharged to a nursing home predominantly, whereas Latino and Hispanic older adults were discharged to a home. And so, that being said, maybe they were being discharged to intergenerational homes that were prepared to take care of them. So that's interesting to think about in terms of the fall injuries and people being discharged from a hospital. It's also interesting to think about in terms of our homeless population, which, as you know, has been growing in recent years. And so maybe the people who are on the streets aren't able to capitalize on those intergenerational relationships. For whatever reason, they don't have family bonds that allow them to move back into their home, whereas we know maybe 30% or more of young adults are able to do that. So it's interesting to think about in terms of housing affordability and homelessness as an issue as well. Next slide, please. So back to this list. I want to talk right now about the reducing isolation and mixed use developments. This slide I already showed you, so it's repetitive. Thank you. A mixed use development, what does that mean? This is a pre-pandemic goal, right? We need to have services and retail on the lower level. We need to have apartment living up top. Think about New York rather than LA. Maybe the downtown LA Arts District would be something to think about as a new version. But mixed use developments, also sometimes called smart growth, are something that planners and gerontologists alike would tout as the best way to think about aging, where people might not be able to drive a car and they wouldn't need to because they can access everything they need right within a few steps of their front door. Next slide, please. You know, in some countries, having a train, and in many parts of our country, having a train a few steps from your front door is a perk, and people think of that as a good thing. Here in Los Angeles, the research I've seen and the experiences I've had is that people complain when they have a train coming into their neighborhood. So anyway, Los Angeles has not been an example of a perfect age-friendly environment in the past. Next slide, please. So I want to ask you why you live in or near a city, near a metropolitan area. Is it for the restaurants? Is it to be near family? Is it to be near medical care? Is it to be near art galleries or the symphony or the LA Philharmonic? Or is it to be near your job? And so these things have been taken into consideration, of course, in this pandemic era. And people have been realizing, I don't need to be near a city. I don't have to go to work. Restaurants, cultural and arts activities are shut down. So maybe I can move out of town. So I know my mother, she loves going to the Chicago Symphony where my parents live. And she's very upset at the thought she may never return to the Chicago Symphony. She's also a former art gallerist. And so the idea of going to museums and participating that way, the loss of that has been really, really hard on her because it's been a part of her entire life. So the thought of will she be able to return to this is very difficult. And maybe for some of you as well. Next slide, please. So during the pandemic, we talked about pre-pandemic, but now during the pandemic, what is the ideal age-friendly housing? So we in Los Angeles were kind of comparing ourselves to New York at the beginning of this pandemic, thinking, oh, luckily we don't live in such tight quarters, right? When the pandemic was raging there. And of course, now it's been raging here in California in recent weeks and months. And so we've had to examine why. Why is it worse here? We do know that during this pandemic, a quarter to a third of the labor force is working at home. And it turns out that this ideal age-friendly housing might be living in a single family home in a suburb or even a somewhat rural area or an exurb where we have space, where we can go outside, where we can enjoy nature. So that has been an ideal thing for many of us and many older people to be able to get exercise, enjoy the environment without being in tight quarters. So consider that for yourself. I know in my case, I was thinking about moving into tighter quarters before the pandemic, and I've been happy that I've been in an area where I can take walks outside, wear a mask, of course, but not be so concerned about all my neighbors brushing shoulders with me when I step outside. Next slide, please. So maybe your moving plans have been on hold, as mine have, and I'm reconsidering them. Some of you may have been considering downsizing. Where would you go? So here are two examples. Mirabella at ASU, yes, Arizona State University, has an age-friendly university, and they have a great example under construction, I don't think it's finished yet, of intergenerational housing where older people from the community can live right in proximity to campus. They can access all of the opportunities available on campus. They can even have students living in their midst. That's one example. And also LaSalle College, LaSalle University, and LaSalle Village, which is a very small school in Massachusetts. So, of course, it's nothing like USC, but they went into partnership with the continuing care retirement community next door. And they have really worked into making the university and the retirement community work together in a symbiotic relationship. And it's been a win-win for everyone. It was a win-win for the college, and it's definitely a win for the residents as well. So what do experts predict the housing market will bring? I've been doing all the reading, and of course, all the real estate websites predict that the housing market will continue to boom. Housing sales in cities, smaller cities, and maybe less expensive cities around the country have been booming. Whereas people here in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, they've been realizing that they don't need to stay in tight quarters and they can relocate to a new location. Next slide, please. The housing market is, of course, driven by vacancies. And so the vacancy rate is at an all-time low as of December, and it's expected to go even lower. Next slide. The suggestion is that renters, people who are renting maybe expensive units in the cities on our coastal areas, they have realized, you know what, if I can work from anywhere, I might as well do that. And so let me move to a smaller place, right? It says here that New York City residents have been streaming to upstate New York, Carolinas, Florida, North and South Carolina. San Franciscans and others from the West Coast have been going to Denver, Salt Lake City, Idaho, New Mexico. I know was hot. I was looking at some houses there myself, wondering, wow, maybe now's the time to go check out New Mexico. All right, next slide. So here's the question. Is now the time to change our living arrangement? You may be forced to do so, or you might decide now is the time to sell because I can get a good price for my house, right? I actually know many people who have sold their houses online, right? Without ever having to be present, without hardly having people come in to look. They can look online and then show up and just make sure the house was everything they thought. Next slide, please. So I want to ask you how we survive and thrive if we are staying put. Many of you may be getting the vaccine and may have hopes for the future changing. It's going to be many months, maybe even longer, before life gets back to normal. And so how we survive and thrive has been my concern in the last year, and how older adults and all of us can do that as well in our housing situation. Next slide, please. So this is a little blurry, but one of the biggest things I've been looking at is everyday creative activity. So I taught a 6-week May master class in the summer, and I taught a 3-week winter master class in December about life course and the arts and how we can incorporate art observation, art appreciation, but art making, creative activities into our daily life, and how that can help us, whether we're living alone or we're living with one partner who we haven't been away from in a year, right? And how we can use these creative activities for human flourishing. Next slide, please. And so these are some things you might look at this and say, well, I don't do any of those things, and that's okay. Here on the side is a picture of me from 2019. I was speaking to your group, and our own Miller Fong drew this picture of me on his iPad. We became friends and had some lunches and meetings, met at an art gallery one day before the pandemic, of course. And so our own Miller Fong can give us some inspiration. Of course, we're not all as talented as he is, but we can learn so much from what he does. And many of us have iPads. Many of us, of course, have been cooking. My creative thing has been over decorating our table for any occasion, really getting out my china or my fancy dishes and just putting it all out there on the table. What else is there to do, right? I've had college students around me taking up knitting, sewing. Many young adults have been taking up all these creative things, learning how to make bread, all these kinds of things. I've also, on my daily walks, been committed to doing photography, just with my phone, but really trying to capture the wonder and the magic, whether it's a bird or a flower or a sea anemone, anything I can find outside to really remind me that there's more going on in the actual world than our virtual screens that we're on all day. So I encourage you to, many of you probably already have creative activities you're participating in, but the research shows that as a lifelong habit, even taking up a new skill in your 70s, your 80s, and your 90s can really help with coping, with resilience, with human flourishing, and with staying engaged, engaging your mind, engaging your heart, engaging your soul. It can be a spiritual practice as well. Next slide, please. Here are some of the works of Miller Fong created on his iPad. He's been, of course, doing his architectural drawings, but also engaged in abstract art, which was new for him. And you can get those things printed out and hung on your wall. You can use it to communicate with your children and grandchildren. Maybe you can teach them how to knit over Skype. Or if you're saying, wait a minute, I don't do any of those crafty things, you can get into things like gardening, flower arranging. There's so many things that can get at our creative side and psyche. And research shows, as Gene Cohen, he's the founding father of the creativity and aging movement. He was a psychiatrist and a physician. He really got into studying all this in the late stages of his career. He died of cancer a number of years ago. Next slide, please. So we're about out of time, but creating healthy spaces in your own home that allow for everyday creative activity, whether you're in tight quarters in a studio apartment or whether you live in a large house with a yard, is how we can cope with the unknown of our housing situation, the unknown of what's ahead, right? And so it's so important to incorporate that into our life and our daily existence. So I'll leave it at that. Next slide, please. Feel free to email me. Here I am with Dr. Jim Birin at my PhD graduation. I graduated when I was 40 years old. With my PhD, I worked as a social worker with Holocaust survivors and interned Japanese Americans and for the county housing department. And then I had some babies anyway, and then I came back to get my PhD when I was 35 years old. So here is Jim Birin, who was the founding father of our School of Gerontology. And he was a wonderful role model for us all. So you can look up his work as well. Feel free to email me. And I think that's it for now. We'll have some questions.
Professor Cicero, thank you for that wonderful presentation. It really brought me back when you said you graduated college in 1991 and didn't move home, because I graduated college in 92. And I remember moving home just for a few weeks, and that was it. And like you said, it was definitely less heard of than it is now. So that really hit home, and we thank you for this wonderful presentation. And we do have a few questions for you. And the first question we'd like to ask is, this is kind of a simple one, but it's really intriguing what's happened at ASU. Do you think USC would ever do an age-friendly housing initiative? I don't think we have as much land.
That is a good question. That is a good question. That is for you all to decide. The land is an issue, of course, and the expense of building, but that would be a wonderful thing if USC could put on a age-friendly housing opportunity. I can't speak to how that would work, but I know many of you could look into the idea. We do have students from our program and from other programs around campus that live in retirement communities around LA. Kingsley Manor is one where there's assisted living and independent living, and we always have a student who lives on site. And the director of it recently moved up to Fresno, but he was a graduate of our gerontology program. And so we do try to find opportunities for students to live in generational settings, but wouldn't it be fantastic to increase that opportunity?
Certainly aspirational. And you just mentioned that director moved up to Fresno. Did the director move to Fresno because it's a little less expensive and you probably get a bigger place to live? That probably factored into the decision. Interesting.
100%.
So speaking of Los Angeles, and let's expand a little bit beyond campus, talk about the challenges that LA faces in terms of creating livable city, livable, options for our older population. If you could speak more to that.
Right. Well, that is the challenge. First of all, as we mentioned, land is a premium. I was looking at housing prices the other day just in West LA, and they're crazy, right? So land is a premium, that is an issue, but making age-friendly spaces, we don't have to think about plowing down what we have. We need to think about accentuating and making connections to what we have. So sure, there are settings around Los Angeles that might appear age-friendly, right? I mean, downtown LA has been rebirthed. Some of you may disagree with how it's changed because it's displaced a lot of older people, actually. And that is one issue. Displacing older people who have been living in apartments and housing in order to gentrify is not the goal. The goal is to keep people living where they are if they want to stay there and making opportunities for them to connect. So transportation is a big issue. If you live in Santa Monica, the Big Blue Bus program has expanded to Uber and Lyft, where you pay just, I think, 50 cents to take an Uber or Lyft, and that's sponsored by the city of Santa Monica. Pasadena, Long Beach, they're very proactive with their own programming and health departments. But of course, looking at the behemoth of city of LA, the county of LA is 4,000 square miles. So it's difficult. We just need to look at pockets and see how we can improve age friendliness in those areas. And it's not just physical, it's with these human connections, with social participation, civic engagement, and I would argue the creative side, really figuring out how to tap into people's creativity, because we know musicians, singers, painters work into their 80s, into their 90s. That's not something you have to retire from, and you can take it up. I had a friend who took up playing the viola in his 90s, and I used to have him come play for my class.
So it's fascinating because here in Southern California, we've really tried to get people to be more open to public transportation. Now that we're finally getting people socialized to the idea, then suddenly we have this pandemic which comes on and kind of disperses everybody once again to where they probably want to be in their own spaces, or they want to be able to practice social distancing. But let's talk a little bit more about LA County. And in your professional opinion, do you believe that in these efforts to create all these mixed-use properties that there is some talk about setting aside a certain number of units for older populations? Have you heard any of that, or has that been something that's been advocated for?
Oh, yeah. Well, usually units are set aside to be affordable, right? To have a threshold to be a percentage of the county median income for low or moderate income housing. And I used to work in that area with LA County. So often, though, we what's really been the trend has been senior living, right? And so not necessarily affordable housing. When I talked to a friend who's a mayor of one of the small cities in our county, he said, well, I can't make an age-friendly city. Isn't that just going to be low-income housing? I can't take that to my city. And I said, no, it's not just going to be low-income housing. And you would actually be surprised how much opposition there can be to older adult housing, which, I don't think older adults are too threatening, but, people get upset when they worry about their property values changing. So there are plans for increasing older adult housing in different regards, but we need to make sure it's affordable, right? So if you look at something like a continuing care retirement community, they want you to put in $300,000 to $600,000 in order to move in, right? And so that is not affordable to a large majority of people. And also, it depends, of course, on you probably owning a home and selling it. So we definitely need to work in city settings and in communities across the county and all of Southern California for making sure that more affordable units that are accessible and usable by people of all ages are being made available. And there is a market for that. It's just hard, because senior living industry likes to go to the luxury, right? Let's make more luxury units. I'm not sure how many more luxury units we really need.
Absolutely. I heard about that for the first time actually last week. My mom was telling me that our next door neighbors who own the house next to where I grew up for the last 40 years, they're now buying into one of those communities where it's a six-figure sum just to buy in. It's a new model, but it certainly doesn't speak to the masses. So I appreciated the shout out personally, and I know a lot of my colleagues and friends on campus to Miller Fong, a half-century Trojan board member, a faculty member at the School of Architecture. And you've arrived when Miller Fong actually decides to use you as one of his sketch subjects. And so that was terrific. And, going along the lines of creativity here, which you mentioned about being creative and trying to create that creative life for yourself and that outlet, and tying it back to what our students talked about in the previous session about mindfulness and trying to figure out, maybe some coping. Can you talk a little bit about how that could possibly play into what you've talked about today, maybe tying that content to your content and where there could be a bridge?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's the North Hollywood Senior Arts Colony. There's the Burbank Senior Arts Colony. There's one in Long Beach as well. So you could Google those and look those up. They're actually looking for applicants to live in some of those communities. And it says you don't have to be an artist to move in here. But, you don't need to move into a senior arts colony in order to tap into your creative side. Even just figuring out around your home what you can do that gets at your creative process, that makes a practice, like a daily practice, a spiritual practice, mindful practice that can help you with thinking about other things than the stresses of life, right? So many of us might just listen to music as something that's therapeutic for us. And I mean, I learned to play piano when I was a kid, but every now and then I try to play some little ditty on our little keyboard we have, right? That's not really good music by any of the stretch of the imagination, but just figuring out in our own space what we can do to let these practices become part of what we do. And you may have rituals, whether it's religious or otherwise, that help you in a given day, but incorporating more rituals that help us get at this thing is really important.
Well, thank you, Professor Cicero, on behalf of our wonderful half-century Trojan community who has joined us here today. Thank you for coming back and visiting with us on our 13th annual Going Back to College Day. Certainly given all of us a lot to think about, those of our half-century Trojans who have joined us today, and also those of us who maybe are working with and listening to our parents talk about what their next stages are going to be in dealing with their surroundings and how they're going to move forward. So we thank you again. We wish you well, and we hope to see you on campus next time. So thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. So long. Pleasure to be here.
Fight on. Thank you.